"Does she work for you?" the young woman asked with a polite smile, glancing at me as I stood beside the champagne cart in my emerald green dress. My husband barely looked up from his conversation before giving a small laugh. "Something like that," Charles said, and the men around him chuckled softly into their crystal glasses while I stood there holding a silver tray like a stranger in my own marriage. I smiled the way women my age learn to smile after decades of disappointment. Small, quiet, careful not to embarrass anyone. The ballroom at the Hartford Regency shimmered under golden chandeliers, every table covered in white roses and candles that smelled faintly of vanilla. A string quartet played near the marble staircase while wealthy donors drifted through the room discussing stock portfolios, summer homes in Nantucket, and private schools for grandchildren who would never know what it meant to struggle. I used to belong in rooms like this. At least, I thought I did. 42 years earlier, Charles Whitmore had held my hand so tightly during our first charity gala that my fingers ached. Back then, he introduced me as the smartest woman in the room. Somewhere between raising our son, rescuing his company during its early years, and organizing every detail of his carefully polished life, I became invisible. Not unloved exactly. That would have required emotion. I had become useful instead. "Margaret," Charles said sharply without turning toward me. "Table 7 needs another bottle of the reserve Cabernet." The men continued talking while I nodded automatically. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I crossed the ballroom toward the serving station. A waiter reached for the tray, but I shook my head gently. "I've got it," I whispered. He looked relieved. Most people at these events assumed I worked for the hotel anyway. Charles preferred it that way. The less attention directed toward me, the more attention remained on him. I poured wine for strangers while my husband laughed 20 feet away beside a state senator and 2 investment executives. No one asked me to sit. No one asked my opinion. I had spent years telling myself it didn't matter. That marriage changed. That people grew older and quieter and more practical. But standing there beneath those glittering chandeliers, I suddenly felt tired in a way sleep could never fix. "Mrs. Whitmore?" One of the coordinators hurried toward me looking flustered. "There's someone here asking for you specifically." I frowned slightly. "For me?" "Yes, ma'am. He just arrived." Before I could respond, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. It was subtle at first. Conversations lowering, heads turning, phones discreetly appearing beneath dinner napkins. Then I saw him entering through the grand archway surrounded by security and hotel staff moving nervously around him. Edward Ashford. Even at 72, he carried the kind of presence money couldn't buy and age couldn't diminish. Tall, silver-haired, impossibly composed. The billionaire investor rarely attended public charity events anymore, which explained why half the room suddenly stopped breathing. Charles straightened his jacket immediately, his entire posture changing as Edward crossed the ballroom. Men like my husband spent years chasing approval from men like Edward Ashford. I lowered my eyes and adjusted the tray in my hands, hoping to avoid attention. Then Edward stopped walking. Completely. His gaze locked onto mine from across the ballroom. For one strange second, the noise disappeared. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. All of it faded beneath the weight of recognition in his expression. Slowly, he stepped forward. "Margaret Whitmore," he said softly, almost like he couldn't believe it himself. The tray trembled slightly in my hands. Charles turned pale beside the senator. And for the first time in decades, someone in that room looked at me as if I mattered. The silence that followed felt heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging above the ballroom. Edward Ashford stood perfectly still in the center of the crowded gala, his gray eyes fixed on me with the kind of recognition I had not seen directed at me in years. Around him, conversations slowed into whispers. People began pretending not to stare while staring anyway. I could almost feel Charles calculating the situation beside me, trying to understand why one of the most powerful men in the country was looking at his wife like she belonged in the room more than anyone else. "It has been a very long time," Edward said quietly as he stepped closer. His voice had not changed much. Older perhaps, rougher around the edges, but steady, familiar. I tightened my fingers around the silver tray. "Yes," I answered softly. "It has." Charles suddenly appeared beside me with the polished smile he used for investors and politicians. "Mr. Ashford," he said quickly, extending his hand. "Charles Whitmore. We met briefly at the Hartford Development Summit last spring." Edward glanced at Charles for barely a second before shaking his hand politely. Of course, he replied. Then his attention returned to me almost immediately. Margaret was one of the brightest people I knew back at Columbia. My breath caught slightly. Columbia. I had not heard anyone connect my name to that part of my life in decades. Around us, a few guests exchanged surprised looks. One woman lowered her champagne glass halfway to the table. Charles laughed softly, though I recognized the tension beneath it. My wife does not usually mention college days anymore. Wife. Not Margaret. Never Margaret. Edward studied me carefully. That is unfortunate, he said. She gave the most extraordinary economic presentation I had ever heard when we were 21 years old. Half the faculty talked about it for months. I looked down instinctively, embarrassed by the sudden attention. Once upon a time, professors had told me I would run companies, build institutions, speak in rooms where decisions shaped entire industries. Then Daniel was born early. Charles needed help with the business. 1 year became 5. 5 became 20. Somewhere along the way, my world narrowed into grocery lists, dinner parties, and remembering how everyone took their coffee. You remember that? I asked quietly. Edward smiled faintly. Some things are impossible to forget. The string quartet resumed playing near the staircase, but the mood in the room had shifted completely now. I noticed several guests watching Charles instead of admiring him. That alone felt unfamiliar. My husband adjusted his cufflinks. Margaret has always preferred staying out of the spotlight, he said smoothly. Edward did not smile this time. Did she? He asked. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, I watched my husband struggle to control a conversation. A waiter approached nervously and reached for the tray in my hands. Allow me, ma'am. I handed it over with relief. My shoulders ached from carrying it. Edward noticed immediately. Would you join me for coffee tomorrow morning? He asked. There are some things I would very much like to discuss with you. Charles answered before I could. Margaret stays very busy managing our home. Edward looked directly at him. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous in the quietest possible way. I was asking Margaret. The ballroom fell silent again around us. I realized then that I could not remember the last time someone had waited for my answer instead of assuming it for me. I looked at Edward, then at Charles standing rigid beside me beneath the golden lights. And for the first time in many years, I heard my own voice before anyone else's. Coffee sounds lovely, I said. I barely slept that night. The Whitmore estate sat silent beneath the Connecticut rain, every room dim except for the kitchen where I stood alone at 5:30 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The house had once felt enormous in an exciting way when Charles and I bought it 30 years earlier. Back then, every empty room represented possibility. Children, holidays, grandchildren someday running through the hallways. Now the silence felt expensive instead of warm. The kind of silence that echoed. I stood at the marble counter staring out the tall windows while rain slid slowly down the glass. Upstairs, Charles was still asleep. Or pretending to be. We had barely spoken during the drive home from the gala. He spent most of it answering emails on his phone while I looked out at the dark highway, wondering why hearing my own name spoken with respect had unsettled me so deeply. Margaret Whitmore. Edward had said it. Like it meant something. Like I meant something. Charles entered the kitchen precisely at 6:15 wearing pressed slacks and one of his navy cashmere sweaters. Even retired men like my husband dressed for battle. He paused when he saw me already awake. You are up early, he said flatly. I nodded slightly and reached automatically for another coffee cup. I can make you eggs if you would like. Just toast. His response came quickly, distracted. He sat at the island scrolling through financial headlines while I moved around the kitchen out of habit more than thought. Bread into the toaster. Butter placed beside his plate. Orange juice poured exactly halfway because too much irritated him. For years I told myself these details were acts of love. Lately they felt more like maintenance. You seemed very comfortable with Edward Ashford last night, Charles said casually without looking up from his phone. There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Calculation. I spread butter across his toast carefully. We knew each other in college. Apparently. He finally looked at me then. You never mentioned that one of the richest men in the country spent his evening praising you in front of investors. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Charles had spent decades interrupting me before I could finish stories, correcting my opinions in front of guests, and dismissing entire conversations halfway through. There were many things I had stopped mentioning simply because no one listened long enough to hear them. "You never asked," I said quietly. Something flickered across his face before disappearing. Irritation, perhaps, or surprise that I had answered at all. He folded his newspaper sharply. "I assume this coffee meeting is unnecessary." I placed his plate in front of him. "I already accepted." Charles leaned back slowly in his chair. "Margaret, men like Edward Ashford do not reconnect with people for sentimental reasons." "Maybe not." "Then be careful." The warning sat strangely between us. Not protective, territorial. I sat across from him for the first time during breakfast instead of remaining standing beside the counter. Charles noticed immediately. His eyes lowered slightly as if something about the change bothered him. "Do you remember my senior thesis?" I asked suddenly. He frowned. "What?" "At Columbia. The urban economic redevelopment proposal." He stared at me blankly for 2 full seconds before taking a sip of coffee. "That was 40 years ago." I looked down at my untouched toast. Edward remembered. Charles said nothing after that. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked softly through the silence. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight slowly began breaking through the clouds across the back lawn. For the first time in years, breakfast with my husband did not feel routine. It felt like standing near a crack spreading quietly through glass. The cafe overlooked the harbor in downtown Hartford, all polished wood floors and oversized windows filled with pale, autumn sunlight. I arrived 10 minutes early out of instinct. Women my generation arrived early for everything. Lunches, doctor appointments, school meetings. We were raised to believe making people wait was a form of selfishness. I chose a small corner table near the window and folded my hands in my lap, while waiters moved quietly between businessmen carrying leather briefcases and women in tailored coats, discussing nonprofit boards and charity auctions. 20 years ago, I would have fit naturally into a room like this. Now I felt oddly uncertain, like someone returning to a hometown after decades away. Edward arrived exactly at noon. No entourage, no security hovering beside him this time. Just a charcoal overcoat, and the same calm presence that somehow made every person in the room notice him without understanding why. He smiled when he saw me standing. "You still arrive early," he said warmly. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "And you still notice everything." He held my chair as I sat down, a small gesture so old-fashioned it almost startled me. Charles had not done that in years. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, sailboats drifted slowly across the gray water while the city moved around us in quiet November light. "You look tired, Margaret," Edward said gently. Not insulting, not pitying, just honest. I looked down at the menu even though I had no intention of reading it. "That happens with age." "No," he said softly. "Not like this." The waitress arrived, and Edward ordered coffee while I asked for tea. Earl Grey. The same tea I drank all through graduate school while writing research papers late into the night. Edward remembered that too. "You used to stay in the library until 2 in the morning, he said with a faint smile. "Everyone else gave up halfway through the semester. You never did." I stared at him quietly. It is strange which parts of yourself survive inside other people's memories. "That girl feels very far away now," I admitted. Edward leaned back slightly, studying me carefully. "No, she does not." I looked out the window before answering. "Life changes people." "Sometimes," he said. "And sometimes people slowly disappear because everyone around them benefits from their silence." The words landed harder than I expected. I wrapped both hands around my teacup after the waitress brought it, letting the warmth steady me. No one had spoken to me this directly in years. Most people preferred comfortable conversations. Weather, charity events, grandchildren. Nobody asked difficult questions unless they wanted something. Edward reached into his leather briefcase and carefully placed an old folded paper on the table between us. My breath caught instantly. It was yellowed slightly with age, but I recognized my handwriting immediately. "Your Columbia redevelopment thesis," he said. I kept a copy. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the pages. Charts, economic projections, margin notes written in blue ink. 43 years disappeared in an instant. I remembered sitting cross-legged on a dorm room floor surrounded by textbooks and cheap takeout containers while snow fell outside campus windows. I remembered believing I would build something meaningful with my life. "Why would you keep this?" I whispered. Edward smiled sadly. Because it was brilliant. I swallowed hard and looked back down at the paper. No one had used that word for me in a very long time. At home, I was efficient, reliable, organized, helpful. Brilliant belonged to someone I used to be before years of quiet compromises sanded the edges off my identity. Edward stirred his coffee slowly. Do you know what Charles told people at the gala after you left the room? I looked up carefully. He said you hated business discussions and preferred staying behind the scenes. A faint ache spread through my chest. Not because it surprised me, because once upon a time, I had started believing it myself. The house felt different when I returned that afternoon. Not physically. The same stone driveway curved through the bare maple trees. The same fountain sat motionless in the center circle where Charles once insisted every successful family needed a proper entrance. But something inside me had shifted quietly during lunch with Edward, and now every room seemed to reveal details I had trained myself not to notice. I walked through the foyer slowly, removing my gloves one finger at a time while sunlight stretched across the marble floors. The portraits on the walls suddenly looked strange to me. Every photograph told the story of Charles Whitmore. Awards dinners, ribbon cuttings, golf tournaments, business magazine covers framed in silver. I appeared beside him in almost every image, smiling politely like decorative proof of stability. The perfect wife. Elegant, silent, replaceable. I climbed the staircase toward Charles's office, intending only to change clothes before dinner. Halfway down the upstairs hallway, I heard voices through the partially closed office door. I stopped instinctively when I recognized Olivia's laugh. My daughter-in-law visited often during weekdays now, though she rarely spoke to me longer than necessary. The investors are expecting the announcement before January, Olivia said smoothly. That gives you enough time to finalize everything before the transition. I stood perfectly still. Charles answered in the calm business tone he reserved for strategy meetings. Margaret will not make this complicated. She avoids conflict. There was a brief pause followed by the soft clink of a glass against wood. Still, Olivia said carefully, you should move sooner rather than later. Once the company goes public, divorce headlines become expensive. My hand tightened slowly around the staircase railing. Divorce. The words settled into my chest with surprising calm. Not shock exactly. More like the final puzzle piece sliding into place after years of subtle humiliations I had refused to name honestly. Charles exhaled heavily. She has no idea how any of the financial structures work anyway. Most assets are protected. And the house? Olivia asked. The trust covers that. Margaret will receive a settlement generous enough to avoid sympathy from the board. Sympathy from the board. I stared at the hallway wall while my pulse beat quietly in my ears. 42 years of marriage reduced to a public relations concern. You should have done this years ago, Olivia added softly. Charles laughed under his breath. I needed stability while building the company. The words did not hit me like a knife. Knives are sharp and sudden. This felt older than that. Like standing inside a room, slowly losing oxygen without realizing it until the dizziness begins. I thought about the tiny apartment where Charles and I lived during our first years together while he struggled to launch Whitmore Capital. I remembered selling my mother's jewelry to help cover payroll during the recession of 1987. I remembered staying awake until midnight proofreading investor presentations while Daniel slept in a bassinet beside my desk. Stability. That was the word he chose for me. Not partner. Not wife. Not the woman who carried half his ambition on her back while pretending not to notice the weight. She will be fine, Charles said finally. Margaret adapts to whatever role she is given. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy, comfortable, as if they both believed it completely. I stepped backward carefully before either of them noticed me outside the door. My legs felt strangely steady as I walked downstairs into the kitchen. The staff had already left for the evening, leaving the room quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a glass of water and stood alone beside the sink staring out at the darkening backyard. Adapt. The word echoed softly in my mind. For decades, I had adapted to every version of neglect Charles handed me. Smaller dinners, smaller conversations, smaller pieces of myself. But standing there in the fading Connecticut light, I realized something that frightened me almost as much as the divorce itself. I was no longer certain I wanted to adapt anymore. The next morning, I opened the closet in the guest bedroom where I kept boxes of things nobody cared enough to notice anymore. Old notebooks, photo albums, Christmas decorations wrapped in yellowing newspaper. For years, I stored pieces of myself there the same way people store furniture they no longer use, but cannot quite throw away. Dust floated through the pale morning light as I pulled down a heavy cardboard box from the top shelf. Inside were dozens of folders from another lifetime. Research papers, business projections, lecture notes from Columbia. I sat cross-legged on the floor, slowly turning pages while the house remained silent around me. Every document felt strangely alive in my hands, as if the woman who wrote them had simply been sleeping all these years waiting for someone to wake her up again. One folder contained the original market restructuring proposal I created for Charles during the company's first year. I stared at the familiar charts and handwritten calculations while memories returned in fragments. Me sitting at our tiny kitchen table in New Haven with Daniel asleep beside me. Charles pacing the apartment, terrified investors would pull funding by Friday morning. My idea to target distressed manufacturing acquisitions instead of competing directly with larger firms. 3 months later, Whitmore Capital survived because of that strategy. 5 years later, Charles called it his breakthrough vision in an interview with Forbes. I had almost forgotten. Around 11 o'clock, my phone rang softly beside the stack of papers. Edward. I hesitated before answering. Good morning, I said quietly. Margaret, he replied warmly. I hope I am not interrupting anything important. I looked down at 40 years of forgotten work spread across the carpet. Actually, I said slowly, you might be the reason I finally started something important. He laughed gently under his breath. That sounds promising. By noon, I found myself driving into the city again. This time, not for a charity gala or one of Charles's corporate dinners where wives sat quietly discussing vacation homes while men negotiated power over expensive bourbon. Edward had invited me to visit the Ashford Foundation headquarters downtown. The building overlooked the river with enormous glass windows reflecting the pale winter sky. Elegant, modern, alive. A young assistant greeted me immediately when I arrived. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Ashford is expecting you. Mrs. Whitmore. Even now, the name felt less like an identity and more like a title someone handed me decades ago. Edward stood near the conference room windows reviewing documents when I entered. There you are, he said with an easy smile. Not formal, not performative, simply glad to see me. On the long walnut table sat several folders and a digital presentation already prepared. What is all this? I asked carefully. Edward motioned for me to sit beside him. Urban redevelopment initiatives, he explained. The foundation is funding economic recovery projects in smaller industrial cities across the Northeast. I frowned slightly as he slid a proposal toward me. Why are you showing me this? Edward looked genuinely confused by the question. Because you understand this field better than most people I know. The sentence settled over me so quietly I almost missed its weight. Better than most people I know. For years, Charles introduced me as someone who preferred flowers, dinner menus, and charity seating charts. Meanwhile, the part of me that once analyzed economic systems slowly disappeared behind perfectly folded napkins and holiday guest lists. Edward opened another file filled with redevelopment projections. I would like your opinion before next week's board meeting. I stared at the pages in front of me while something unfamiliar stirred beneath my ribs. Not anger, not grief. Something steadier than that. Hunger, perhaps. The kind that returns slowly after believing for years you no longer need to eat. Edward leaned back, watching me quietly. Margaret, he said softly, you spent decades convincing yourself your mind no longer mattered. I think you were wrong. For the first time in many years, I believed he might be right. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror studying a woman I barely recognized. Not because I looked younger. Life does not work that way. My silver hair still framed the same face, shaped by decades of compromise and quiet endurance. The lines around my eyes remained. The softness beneath my chin remained. But something heavier had disappeared. I noticed it first in my posture. My shoulders no longer curved inward apologetically when I entered a room. I no longer moved through my own house like a guest trying not to disturb anyone. Small changes came first. I reopened the personal bank account I had closed 27 years earlier after Charles insisted joint finances were simpler. I started reading financial journals over morning coffee instead of decorating magazines I never truly cared about. Twice a week, I drove into Hartford for meetings at the Ashford Foundation, where people listened when I spoke instead of waiting for me to finish so they could redirect the conversation elsewhere. Edward never treated my opinions like charming surprises. He treated them as expected contributions. That difference changed something inside me faster than I wanted to admit. Your projections are too conservative, I told one of the foundation analysts during a redevelopment meeting Tuesday afternoon. The young man blinked twice before looking down at his spreadsheet. Excuse me. I leaned forward slightly and pointed toward the data. You are assuming population decline will continue at the same rate over 10 years. But infrastructure reinvestment changes migration patterns faster than your model allows for. Silence settled briefly around the conference table. Then Edward smiled slowly beside me. That, he said calmly, is exactly what I told them yesterday. The analyst adjusted his glasses awkwardly before nodding. I had not considered that variable. I almost laughed afterward driving home through downtown traffic because of how natural the entire exchange had felt. No performance, no permission needed, just thought and response flowing the way it once had before. Years of domestic silence dulled my confidence into something manageable for other people. At home, Charles noticed the changes immediately, even though he pretended otherwise. He noticed when I stopped laying out his clothes in the morning. He noticed when I missed one of his investor dinners because I had foundation meetings in Boston. He noticed when I began answering questions directly instead of softening every opinion before speaking. You seem distracted lately, he remarked one evening while we sat across from each other in the dining room, surrounded by polished silver and untouched conversation. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Busy, I corrected. His expression tightened slightly. Doing what exactly? I looked at him calmly. Working. The word lingered awkwardly between us because neither of us knew how to place it inside the version of me Charles preferred. Wives volunteered, hosted, assisted. They did not work unless the work benefited their husbands directly. Charles took a sip of wine. Edward appears to be taking a significant interest in your time. Edward respects my experience. And what experience would that be? The question came too quickly, too sharp. I set down my fork quietly. The experience of helping build an investment company from nothing while raising a child and managing every invisible detail that allowed your career to function uninterrupted for 4 decades. Charles stared at me in complete silence. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the tension. You are exaggerating your role, he said finally. I almost responded automatically the way I used to. Apologize. Retreat. Minimize myself before conflict escalated. But something inside me had changed too much already. No, I said quietly. I think I spent years understating it. For the first time in our marriage, Charles looked uncertain of who was sitting across from him. And strangely enough, so did I. The investor dinner took place at the Ashford Foundation's winter benefit in Manhattan, a black tie event held inside an old hotel ballroom overlooking Central Park. Snow drifted softly beyond the tall windows while waiters moved through the room carrying silver trays filled with champagne and tiny crab cakes no one actually ate. I stood near the entrance adjusting the sleeve of my black evening gown, suddenly aware of how different this night felt from every gala I had attended beside Charles over the years. For once, I was not there as decoration. Edward had invited me personally to present redevelopment projections to several major investors considering partnership with the foundation. The idea still felt unreal each time I remembered it. You look nervous, Edward said quietly as he approached beside me. I smiled faintly. I spent 30 years forgetting how to do this. No, he replied gently. You spent 30 years being told not to. The ballroom slowly filled with governors, investors, university trustees, and nonprofit executives. Conversations floated through the air beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, while a jazz pianist played softly near the stage. I recognized several faces from old Whitmore Capital events. Men who used to nod politely at me before turning immediately back toward Charles as though I were part of the furniture. Tonight, some of them looked confused seeing me standing beside Edward Ashford holding presentation notes instead of a serving tray or seating chart. Charles arrived nearly 40 minutes later accompanied by Olivia and 2 board members from Whitmore Capital. The moment he saw me across the ballroom, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. Surprise first, then irritation, then something far less comfortable. Uncertainty. I noticed his eyes pause briefly on the people gathered around me listening while I explained redevelopment tax structures to a senator from Massachusetts. Charles had never seen anyone ask for my opinion in rooms like this before. He crossed the ballroom slowly, every movement polished and controlled. "Margaret," he said evenly once he reached us. "I did not realize you would be attending tonight." Before I could answer, Edward turned calmly toward the small group beside us. "Actually," he said, "Margaret is the reason half of tonight's proposals exist." Silence settled over the circle. Immediately, Charles gave a short laugh. "I was unaware my wife had become an economist overnight." Edward's expression never changed. "She already was one long before you met her." The words landed softly but carried enough weight to quiet the entire conversation around us. One of the investors frowned slightly. "Wait," he said, looking toward me. "Are you the Margaret Whitmore who wrote the Columbia Urban Restructuring Thesis in 1979? I blinked in surprise. "You know about that?" "Know about it," the man replied. "We studied parts of it during graduate school at Wharton." Charles turned toward me slowly. Truly looked at me for perhaps the first time in years. I could almost see him trying to reconcile the woman standing calmly beneath the ballroom lights with the version of me he had spent decades reducing into something smaller and easier to control. Edward motioned toward the stage where presentation materials waited beside a large screen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly to the nearby guests, "before Whitmore Capital became successful acquisition specialists, many of the original recovery models came from Margaret Whitmore's unpublished economic frameworks." A low wave of murmurs spread across the ballroom. Charles's face tightened instantly. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but no words came out quickly enough. For decades, he had controlled every narrative in every room we entered together. Tonight the story moved without his permission. One of the board members looked directly at me with open curiosity. "You designed those models?" I held his gaze calmly. "Some of them," I answered. "A very long time ago." The strange part was not hearing people suddenly respect me. The strange part was realizing I no longer needed Charles to confirm my value before I believed it myself. By the end of January, the newspapers had started mentioning my name without attaching it to Charles's. At first, it was only small things buried inside business columns. Margaret Whitmore joins Ashford Foundation Advisory Initiative. Economic redevelopment proposal gains support from former Columbia researcher. Quiet headlines most people would overlook. But Charles noticed every single one. I could tell by the way he folded the newspaper too sharply at breakfast or how his jaw tightened whenever my phone rang during dinner. The strange thing was that I no longer organized my days around his reactions. My schedule belonged to me again. On the first Thursday in February, the governor's winter philanthropy gala took place at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. Snow covered the sidewalks outside, while photographers crowded near the entrance capturing politicians, investors, and nonprofit leaders beneath the glow of gold chandeliers. I arrived alone wearing a midnight blue gown I had almost donated years earlier because Charles once said the color drew too much attention. Edward met me near the ballroom staircase with an expression that softened the moment he saw me. "You look like yourself again," he said quietly. I smiled before answering. I was beginning to wonder if she still existed. Inside the ballroom, conversations floated beneath orchestral music and crystal glassware. For the first time in decades, I did not feel invisible entering a crowded room. People greeted me directly now, asked questions, introduced me to colleagues. One woman from a Boston development firm shook my hand warmly and said she had been studying my original urban recovery models all month. I almost laughed hearing those words aloud. Across the ballroom, Charles stood beside several Whitmore Capital board members watching me with an expression I could no longer fully read. Not anger exactly. Something more unsettling than that. Recognition perhaps. The realization that the person he dismissed for years had never actually disappeared. She had simply stopped speaking loudly enough for him to hear her. Later that evening, during the foundation presentation, Edward stepped onto the stage beneath the massive crystal chandeliers while the room slowly quieted around him. "Before we conclude tonight," he said calmly into the microphone, "there is someone I would like to acknowledge properly." I felt my stomach tighten slightly as his gaze found mine across the ballroom. "For many years," Edward continued, "Margaret Whitmore contributed extraordinary work behind closed doors while others accepted credit publicly. Tonight, that changes. Soft applause spread through the room as dozens of faces turned toward me. I saw surprise in some expressions, respect in others. Charles remained perfectly still near the back of the ballroom, one hand wrapped tightly around a champagne glass. Edward extended his hand toward me. "Margaret," he said gently, "would you join me?" The walk toward the stage felt strangely peaceful. No triumph, no revenge, just clarity. For years I imagined freedom would arrive dramatically with shouting or bitterness or public humiliation. Instead, it arrived quietly beneath warm ballroom lights while I stepped fully into my own name again. Edward smiled as I reached the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the smartest economic strategist I have ever known." The applause grew louder this time. Real. Earned. I looked out across the ballroom and saw Charles staring at me like a man realizing too late that he had spent decades living beside something rare without ever understanding its value. After the presentation ended, he approached me near the coat check with unusual hesitation. "Margaret," he began carefully, "perhaps we should talk when we return home." Home. The word sounded different now too. Smaller somehow. I slipped on my gloves slowly before meeting his eyes. "For years," I said quietly, "you introduced me as your wife because it made me easier to overlook." Charles opened his mouth, but I continued softly before he could answer. Tonight people finally met me. Snow drifted gently outside the hotel windows behind him. For the first time in 42 years, I felt no need to make myself smaller so someone else could feel important. I walked toward the waiting car beneath the glow of Manhattan lights while cameras flashed softly near the entrance, and Edward held the door open with quiet respect. Somewhere behind me, Charles Whitmore remained standing alone in the ballroom, where everyone had finally learned my name.